Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest today is Laura Appleman, Van Winkle Melton Professor of Law at Willamette University College of Law. We will discuss her new article, Deviancy, Dependency, and Disability, The Forgotten History of Eugenics and Mass Incarceration, which will appear shortly in the Duke Law Journal. So welcome to the podcast, Laura.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much for having me.
The pleasure is all mine. And I must say, I found your paper incredibly powerful and in many ways quite disturbing as well. And I really appreciated the way you engaged with both history and policy in the interaction between the two in the paper. And
thank you.
Obviously, I want to spend a lot of time talking about both of those issues.
Sure.
But I think my sense reading the paper was that there were some kind of core concepts that might be helpful for listeners for you to talk about a little bit how you're using them in the context of your discussion so that it'll make more sense as we discuss this. So in particular, I felt like you used the word disability or disabled people in a way that was maybe more historically capacious than a lot of other people think of it. I was wondering if you could just sort of explain, how you're using the term and why you're using it in that way.
Sure. So one of the challenges of writing this paper in, a modern sense was, talking about disability, but talking about it in both the language and I guess the broader understanding of people who are differently abled in times past. Now, as you can imagine, some of that language was, what we quite honestly would now find very offensive. But I think the other aspect is that I think we tend to have these very sort of neat lines now. We have cognitive disability, and we have mental illness, and we have physical disability. And I think one of the things to remember about really, I would say up until the 1970s or so, or even later, is that, our ancestors did not have that way of distinguishing. I think a lot of it because they just didn't understand. And so, not only, a lot of these sort of phrases that we'll be talking about, everyone was sort of lumped together. And there really was, I think especially when you talk about who ended up in asylums in the sort of late 19th and earliest 20th century, really was almost a grab bag of people and things where, now we have, just treatments for, or, the great glorious antibiotics. And so, and really going through the piece, I have to actually credit my, editors at at Duke, because they really, I think, pushed me to sort of clarify, because, I think there's so many, ways to refer to this, and some of it is very sloppy. And so, I think tying this in with the disability rights, thing was actually very challenging because it's hard to write respectfully about this when you actually use the terminology of the era.
I was really impressed by how you were able to talk about all of those. Yeah, and I agree, in many cases, very offensive ways of referring to people with different, in different situations, and to sort of make sense of them in a historical context and analogize them to similar problems that we might still have today.
Right. Well, one of the things that I think is important to, I think it's easy to, when you're writing a piece of paper, like, oh my goodness, they were just so backwards, all of those people. And yet, if you look, and so the last part of my paper, when you look at sort of how we treat people with disabilities today, it's not that different. We have better language, but our actions are actually sort of worryingly the same. It was a fascinating piece to write. It was also a very depressing piece to write. It's like, this is not necessarily what you would want to find. And so, I guess, anyone who sort of goes into this, I caution, it's people like, well, obviously we know better, but I wonder what, the future will say about us. I guess that's my concern, my question.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point, especially as we get to sort of some of the problems with incarceration in how we think about it today in relation to disabled people. But that was another term I was hoping that you could kind of give a little context to, because you use it in a way that I think is very productive in a kind of historiographical sense, but that might not be intuitively familiar to people today.
Right. So, I guess, when we talk about disability in the past, really, I guess we tended, people tended to lump cognitive disability and mental illness and some physical disability all into one stew. And, and I think, in our earlier days, I think we just had no way of differentiating it. But later on, right, which is, I think, sort of, for me anyway, where the most disturbing piece of the article talks about, where, for example, seizure disorders, right, or epilepsy. So, back in the very old days, people were thought to be, quite honestly, touched by God. But by the time we got to the late 19th century, with its great desire to sort of sort and put people in various, containers or definitions, it had very much been turned into just another cognitive disability, even though, of course, it has nothing to do with cognitive disabilities, right? I mean, it is literally, yes, it technically has something to do with the brain. The other big example, of course, was syphilis. Always, we don't hear much about syphilis nowadays, which I guess is a good thing. But, until antibiotics were widely available, which really wasn't until the mid 50s, right? They had some early antibiotics for World War II, but they weren't available to the public. And so with syphilis, you would be infected, and then with primary syphilis, and then secondary syphilis, you showed I'll be polite here. You showed some sores, but then it went away for a long time. And then, if you were unlucky, you'd get what's called tertiary syphilis, or otherwise known as paresis, in which you basically went insane. And there are actually quite a few people who did this. And also it was contagious, especially to childbearing mothers. So you had children who were born blind from syphilis and stuff. And yet that was also, it was, of course, at that point, a mental illness, but it was, of course, that was really just a physical, a bacteria. And more than that, this is where, a lot of class comes into it. And I think this is one of the things, I sort of generally write or have written over the years on criminal justice and mass incarceration. And I think that one of the things that really isn't discussed as much is class. Obviously, race is the great third whale of criminal justice and mass incarceration, but class plays a large part too. And in this article, I really did see how class worked, and really, I think, helped support all these, all the locking up of various people with so-called disabilities. Because let me tell you, if you were, a robber baron of the late 19th century, you weren't going to one of these asylums, even if you did have tertiary syphilis.
Right. Yeah. And that really struck me because today we think of incarceration as synonymous with kind of criminal imprisonment.
Right.
But you really, for me anyway, productively pointed out how a lot of people were historically incarcerated or effectively incarcerated in a great many other kinds of contexts.
Right. I think, until, right, like at the peak of the asylums, I think the, incarceration rate, which I obviously use very broadly, as in literally, locked in an institution, was like 4 times the corrections incarceration rate. And of course, this is before our great mass incarceration. Of course, this whole article started, sort of thinking about, well, why do we have mass incarceration? And, there's been a lot of books, I think, and I'm pleased about this, saying, well, here's various reasons. And I was like, oh, well, what about, I think Bernie Harcourt had about 20 years ago written a very short piece saying, hey, what about mass institutionalization? I'm like, well, Bernie Harcourt thinks it's true. Must be true. So I looked into it, and indeed, but it was far more than I think I had realized. So that, aspect of we've always, we haven't always locked up people, criminal offenders, but we have in this country always locked up, those that we, I think are differently abled from us. Obviously there's a lot of fear in that. And so that's something I just don't think a lot of people are aware of, at least sort of the general public.
Right. Right. So in light of that, I was wondering if you could give, and there's just so much to cover that we can only skim the surface, but if you could give kind of a potted history of the sort of conceptualization and sort of institutional treatment of, or political legal treatment of disabled people in this broader context during the period of time that you look at in your article, which is really quite broad. But
I'll go very, very, like maybe a sentence or two over the colonial times. It's really sort of the 19th and early 20th century. So, colonial times with these teeny tiny little, communities, they pretty much kept people who were, unable to contribute, right, which was the fulcrum of what you were in colonial society, pretty much at home, the attic, the basement. Occasionally they'd build a little hut in the middle of the green. And that sort of turned mid 18th century roughly into almshouses, right? That was mainly for the poor. But that obviously included people who were disabled because they weren't able to contribute to society. But really the beginning of the 19th century, and late 18th century, we first saw the first asylum, and that was really in large part for the mentally ill, and the very poor. And I think that I want to stop and point out here that this very rigid idea of class really was part and parcel of, the American experiment from the very beginning. And this is, I think, something I also had not realized until I'd done some research, that, first of all, that America was supposed to be, the dumping grounds for the refuse of the, we have this great idea, especially around Thanksgiving, of the Puritans coming. I'm like, yeah, maybe they came and escaped. But everywhere else, so there's this tremendous fear of like sloth and laziness and, bad breeding, right? So sort of a proto-eugenics. And so, as people became more concerned with this and as, sort of industrialization hit, asylums began to be more popular. And this, really took on steam after the 1920s because this great desire to regulate social behavior, right? And so they built we foresee first penitentiaries for the criminal. We see asylums mainly for mentally ill. You start to see the first reformatory. So all these institutions to deal with people who just didn't fit neatly into the social wheel, I guess. But then mid 19th century, it all sort of fell apart because suddenly you have all sorts of people who are now seen as mentally ill and disabled. A lot of this is sort of post-Civil War. You can imagine sort of the post-traumatic stress disorders that are stalking for that. And so we have these asylums, and we have people flooding in you really start having unsurprisingly, a two-tier system. So you have something like in Boston, the McLean, asylum. Now it's the institution where it still takes very wealthy people to deal with their various neurocetic, as they used to call it, issues. And then there was everything else, and in fact, here in Oregon, we have the old Salem House, or the Oregon, mental institution, which is where they filmed Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And so at this point, pretty much and pretty much everyone was thrown in. So not just people who had cognitive disabilities, but also people who had drinking problems, people who were old, people who were homeless, pretty much everyone, because then they were neatly contained. And so that sort of gets us, to the sort of late 19th century, earliest 20th century. And that's when the progressives come in. And so, again, I knew a little bit about sort of the progressive era. The progressives were great at many things, but they also really like institutions. And they like the prison, the reformatory, and the asylum. And the numbers for the asylum really skyrocketed, in part because a lot of states closed the almshouse where they dealt with the poor. Also, I think this idea of madness as a social construct, right? It wasn't just, people who couldn't contribute anymore. It was, people who just don't really fit in. And the progressives did many great things. What they did with asylums, I would say, is sort of a black mark on their record. And so, in other words, they just wanted to quarantine people who just really were irredeemable members of the polity. So mentally ill, cognitively disabled, physically disabled, outside social norms, right? And so now we have, these places where, we don't have to see them. And, it's very easy to send someone away. So no one had any rights. I mean, not just women, anyone could really be sent away. And so, we end up in the late 19th, early 20th century with these, asylums really bursting at the seams, and really sort of a captive audience to practice some eugenic philosophy.
Right. And what was it like in the asylums at that point in time? Because one thing that really struck me powerfully about the kind of historical part of your paper is you talked about the relative sort of social institutional significance as asylums as compared to penitentiaries.
Right. So, I would say that, pretty bad, right? By the late 19th century, there were lots and lots of people in these asylums that really had only been built for a much smaller, these asylums had built in the 1820s, right? So really for a much smaller amount. And so we have scores of people jammed in, virtually no treatment. This is not sort of, like today, this is not where the sort of promising young doctor wanted to come. And lots of people sort of locked up together, right? People who are all different needs and different issues. And so it was sort of like school. I mean, if you think about sort of what happened in California, with the Brown v. Plata litigation, where, people were sort of jammed into, gyms and stuff with lots of disease, sort of like that, but worse buildings, right? And if you can if you want something very interesting, you can actually just Google this. The worst 19th century asylums. People shackled to their beds. Sitting in filth. Really what we would call inhumane and cruel and unusual punishment. As bad as our prisons are, and they're not great, they weren't as bad as this, because these are people who were thought of to have no rights whatsoever, because they weren't. I don't think they were really seen as fully human.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, in a weird way, I almost got the impression that people who were seen as redeemable went to prison, and people
which is ironic. Of course, it's bitterly ironic, but of course, prison was the place. They were literally reformatories, right? So you could actually be reformed, as opposed to being sent to the asylum. You were in there for life, and they could do what they wanted to you, and so we have sort of these famous cases, Buck v. Bell and Skinner versus Oklahoma, sort of, quasi-protesting what's going on. And for the most part, you couldn't have a compulsory sterilization. I think the Supreme Court said fine, but, Buck v. Bell's still good law. It's still cited, all sorts of fascinating, sort of horrible, exemplars of this.
Right. So this was like the story through the mid 20th century.
Yeah.
And then you really chart this like fascinating shift that changes everything while also in some ways is changing nothing.
Right. Well, I mean, look, it's much better, right? So, I mean, really, you have to, it's an interesting shift, why? I mean, sort of a couple of reasons. First, medication, right? So, I mean, I think medication for people who are mentally ill, kids still use some help. That said, the discovery of Thorazine, right, which is a psychotropic or antipsychotic, really changed lives, like to the point where they could actually, that and other antipsychotics, along with some electroshock stuff, psychotherapy, a lot of them convinced a lot of doctors that, even high need institutionalized patients could be released, right? And I think by the 50s anyway, right, there was some realization that maybe these asylums and institutions weren't the best place for people to live. Another big thing, is the disability rights bar. I think that had a huge, they really saw themselves as part of civil rights. And that's not, I think, not quite as well known. And so in 1963, Kennedy signed this Community Mental Health Act, and that basically meant to, basically deinstitutionalize people and let them, and bring them back to their communities and have sort of these local mental health centers. Unfortunately, the second part never happened. So we deinstitutionalized, but we never built these mental health facilities. Now, it's interesting because I think, sort of the popular mind, there's it's Reagan who deinstitutionalized people and then let them starve. Not really, no. I mean, we can blame a lot of people, and, as a law professor, that's my job, right? As long as it's not me. But, really, I mean, it was Congress back in the 60s, and, who knows what would have happened if, the other big mover is Medicaid, right? So 1965, we adopt Medicaid, and Medicaid says, I'm not going to pay for you if you're in an institution. However, I will pay for you in a nursing home, in a general hospital. Similarly with Medicare, right? So suddenly, for states, right? Like it's all about money, isn't it always all about money? Certainly with, corrections as well. It's just like, hey, the feds will pay for this. So let's disassemble. I mean, not to say that there weren't, some serious lawsuits, but those weren't until the 70s, interestingly enough. I mean, so sort of antibiotics. So you don't have a lot of people, with, paresis or tertiary syphilis. And I think maybe just more understanding that epilepsy is, a seizure disorder. It's not some sort of horrific, mental disease. So, all of these things sort of led to, sort of the great deinstitutionalization. But as I mentioned before, we just we never put anything in place to replace it for those people who aren't able to live on their own and don't have a supportive family or family money, right? So it's those people who now fall into the cracks. And those, of course, are largely, but not entirely, swept up by the criminal justice system.
Yeah. No, I mean, what really struck me about that story that you told of the 60s, 70s, and early 80s was this kind of horrific public choice incentives story about sort of deinstitutionalization without any practical institutional thought about what would happen to people after they left the institution. And as you say, we now know what happened to a lot of those people.
Right. I mean, to give President Carter his props, he did sign in 1980 the Mental Health System Act, which was supposed to improve all these things, but Congress blocked it. And so, that was sort of the last attempt. And I think, now we see a lot of people, especially with mental illness. I mean, I would say that's primarily our big, the people with cognitive disabilities, I think have been better helped by people, usually their families, but it's people with sort of more intractable mental illness who, we find difficult to help in sort of an everyday life, or, they leave their families, they, et cetera. They tend to end up, in the criminal justice system, where it's unclear they're doing much better than they were in the asylums to begin with.
Right. So those were like the two category, or there are like two categories of disabled persons that struck me were most wildly deserved by the current circumstance that you described. And it seems like the big one is people suffering from various forms of mental illness who are ultimately reinstitutionalized through the penal system. I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that problem. But in addition, you also talked about people who had other kinds of disabilities, but didn't necessarily have private family member organizations that could care for them.
Right.
And they ended up in, nursing homes and group homes in, unfortunately, not as dissimilar a kind of situation as we might like.
And, the people that I sort of see, I'm a parent with a child, and I see a lot of people who are raising children with autism, and really depending on the level of diagnosis. So the big concern I know in some of the autistic communities is if you have a child who needs a lot of help, well, they age out of a lot of the state support at age 18, and then what? Right. Especially we have a sort of, as parents age. So people who are severely physically disabled and, again, don't have a lot of money, end up in nursing homes that, are covered by Medicaid, but, not really sort of the home-like, circumstances that we would of course want. And so it's those two sets. I think there is at least some awareness of the fancy long word is trans-institutionalization, right? Where so for the mentally ill that they went from asylums to now they're sort of in prisons. But I do think there's these two other sets of people, either the sort of very seriously physically disabled, or people who have spectrum disorders, and their parents can't afford to do much for them after they turn 18. That I think we really, haven't dealt with. And I think, again, it's sort of the same. I think part of the challenge in writing this paper was not to seem sort of too hysterical, like, oh my goodness, eugenics is still here. But it's hard not to see, if you're sort of talking about what I think is often now called ableism, right? That these people are, if you are if all your physical abilities, that means you are, a superior person, or we're more willing to grant you rights. And I think that's absolutely true when we see people, how people treat adults with spectrum disorder. And I think treat adults who are, severely physically disabled. And, to an extent, mental illness as well, because most mental illness, goes in waves. So there's times where people are, immediately cognizant, and times maybe they are less so. But there's this remnant of eugenics that makes me very, very uneasy.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit as well, because I think this is really key to the way your paper intersects with the broader critique of mass incarceration. How this problem manifests itself in the penal situation, and sort of how the history can and should inform how we think about the role of, sort of the criminal justice system in managing people and helping people who are disabled by mental illness.
Great. So we have 4 hours right now. I'll try to make it. So,
Yeah.
I'll just start with mental illness because that is really, I would say, maybe roughly 60% of people incarcerated suffer from mental health illnesses. But I think more important for these purposes, about 20% have a serious mental illness. And I think, you see this, this is, of course, how they get into the criminal justice system, because when they interact with police officers, they are not going to react rationally, right? They're not going to stop. They may be shot. They may be tased. They just, if you are, suffering from mental illness, occasionally, you're just not going to be able to, do what, people want you to do. And, you're going to be much more likely to be homeless, and just, be in a situation where, given how we sort of police homelessness these days, a situation where you may be taken into jail or prison. And then once you're there, or you may do things which are, illegal. And, I'm not saying that they're not, all, some of them are indeed criminal offenders. And then once you're there, the treatment is very, very minimal. And you get some drugs. You're obviously not going to get, the full psychological workup you would if you were, say, an upper middle class person going to, a hospital. But you're not well treated just because there's so many people. I'm not accusing the correctional system of saying, you're purposely mistreating them. I just think there's not enough resources, and there's so many, people in jail or prison. And of course, a lot of mentally ill people are there for misdemeanors, right? Or, there's this Public Citizen in 1992 found that, like, for jails, which are for people who are incarcerated for less than a year, 30% of people there were just mentally ill people who are just waiting for psychiatric evaluation. And this is, they call it emergency detention, which still happens, because we have no beds. We have very few psychiatric hospitals where these people can go. So sometimes they end up, in prison. And of course, once they're in prison, they don't do well because prison, as you can imagine, is a very regulated place. So you have to follow the rules. And if you don't follow the rules exactly, you lose a lot of good time and credits and get a lot of infractions. And that's what happens to people who are mentally ill. They also tend to endure more abuse of force because, they don't listen, or they're not able to listen. And follow that. And so, and I think they're also seen sometimes as an easier target. So, that's what happens to mentally ill. The cognitively disabled prisoners is a little different. There's more, they do interact with the criminal justice system at a higher rate, in part because sometimes they're manipulated into criminal behavior. They're certainly, when they're questioned by police, of course, everyone should just be quiet. Let me just, my general hint to everyone, no matter who you are, if you're questioned by police, the only thing you want to say is, I want my lawyer, and then stop talking. Obviously, if you're cognitively disabled, you're not going to be able to make that determination. Of course, if you've watched Making a Murderer and Brendan Dassey, that's a excellent thing, exemplar of what happens when you just sort of confess. And so they also don't do so well in prison because, again, they just they either can't comprehend or can't conform to jail and prison rules. And so, they too, and then, finally, if we're talking about people with physical disabilities, when they do end up in prison, and this is sort of a more tangential thing, but they also struggle because you're not going to get your ADA accommodations in a correctional facility. Right. You're supposed to, but you don't. So, that's sort of what happens when they get in there. But you actually had a second part of the question, right? Which is, what should we do?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's part 4 of the paper. Very short.
Yeah.
So, again, a lot of this is money. Now, interestingly, in the past couple of years, there's been some calls from psychiatrists, et cetera, to bring back the institution. I think this is a profoundly bad idea. Yes, we probably could use more psychiatric beds for very, very seriously ill patients. But, what we need basically is to fulfill the second half of the community health bill that was never enacted after Kennedy, which is to, most of these individuals, whether they're suffering from mental illness, cognitive disability, et cetera, could thrive in, group homes. And you see this with the private group homes that, people pay for that are not covered by insurance. And, people can have a really sort of meaningful life and, have a lot of joy. But we would have to invest. Now, of course, would this cost less than imprisoning them? Yes. But that's it's very difficult to say, well, let's just cut the prison budget so we can, make these community health things. And given how Medicare and Medicaid work, I'm certainly not a scholar in those two areas. My sense is we'd have to change that a little bit. But just to give some brief numbers, so it costs about $150,000 a year to house and treat individuals in institutional care, whether that's prisons or asylums. Community care, which is at home or small group setting, costs about $30,000 a year. Right. But, to get, there's lots of things that the political will is focused on. I don't get the sense that, dealing with this problem is top on our list right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I think in conclusion, it seems like a lot of the observations that you're making suggest that there's like a sort of lot of intersectional connections between the issues in relation to disability and incarceration and a lot of the other factors often addressed in a mass incarceration context, like, racism, the drug war, classism, and so on and so forth. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts, sort of specific thoughts for the sort of broader community of people concerned with mass incarceration and, something that they might keep in mind in relation to disability and that problem.
Well, I really especially for disability and incarceration, I think the best idea would create, and a couple of places do this, creating sort of local panels to screen people who are arrested but not yet convicted for either mental illness or cognitive disability. And, creating a diversion program. I mean, I think, some of the best results that we've had in correction, reform generally is, some of these community courts, like in Red Hook, they've been doing it for the past 25 years. Alternatives to just, for whatever reason, you've been arrested and now you're going to sort of be chewed up in the maw. And unless you have money and power, there's nothing you can do. So, and this would actually, of course, save us money. And so I think that's something that we could, being much more careful in sort of who we actually send to prison or even jail, and, having lots of alternatives. And that yes, in a perfect world, we'd be like, it's always the Netherlands, right? For every subject, it's always the Netherlands who do like the perfect job. But we're not the Netherlands, right? And we do have this giant prison industrial complex, which I say only quasi-jokingly. And so, to have sort of, before they get into that thing, to have sort of the, special treatment. Okay, so you suffer from mental illness, you have cognitive disability, you're going to go into a special program, which can, if we talk, rehabilitation is something we don't really talk about in corrections anymore, but it should be, and not just for people with disabilities, but really for everyone. So if I had a magic wand, that's what I would do.